1939, the absorption of the lighthouse service. The United States Coast Guard was a unique entity, born of the 1790 Revenue Cutter Service and hardened by the integration of the Life-Saving Service in 1915. Its officers were maritime polymaths, lawmen, rescuers, navigators, and technicians all rolled into one. This pool of expertise deepened when the Lighthouse Service was absorbed into the organization, long before the global war began. The service had already been locked in a grinding, decade-long operational conflict. This was the Rum War, where they chased fast boats and enforced prohibition. That crucible forged a core group of petty officers and commanders whose skills in small boat handling and coastal patrol were unrivaled. They earned the initially derogatory, but ultimately proud title of the Hooligan Navy. By November 1941, the final inevitable step was taken. President Roosevelt formally placed the Coast Guard under the operational control of the Navy Department. The service was now fully armed and integrated, its dual nature as both a law enforcement body and a military force ready to be tested. That test arrived with savage immediacy. Sunday, December 7, 1941, dawned over Pearl Harbor as a typical peacetime morning aboard the 327-foot cutter Taney. Coast Guardsmen were performing routine duties. The morning sun glinted off the massive naval fleet anchored nearby. When the first Japanese planes roared overhead, shattering the calm, the Taney crew scrambled. The air filled instantly with the shriek of diving aircraft and the distant, muffled thunder of explosions. Coast Guard gunners reacted instantly, swinging their 3-inch guns and .50 caliber machine guns toward the sky. They tracked the high-altitude enemy bombers. The deck plates shuddered as the heavy guns recoiled, sending shells into the blue, though the extreme range limited their effect. After 20 minutes, the Taney was locked in combat, a lone Coast Guard cutter trading fire with the Imperial Japanese Navy. Elsewhere, out in the approach to Honolulu Harbor, the patrol craft CGC Tiger was heading toward its wartime station. Its primitive sonar apparatus was useless against the aerial onslaught. The crew watched the black smoke plume over the harbor, feeling utterly helpless, unable to bring their defensive fire to bear. Later that night, as darkness settled over the panicked island, the Tiger maintained its patrol. It soon came under a second, terrifying attack. The hail of machine gun fire erupted from the shore, not Japanese, but incoming rounds from understandably anxious army units. They had mistaken the patrol craft for an enemy vessel. Shots splashed within 100 yards of the hull, a stark, chaotic welcome to a war that had just begun. The galvanizing shock of Pearl Harbor flung the Coast Guard immediately into a global conflict. Yet, they had already begun preparations. Even before the US formally entered the war, the fall of Denmark in 1940 had drawn Coast Guard assets into the freezing, desolate expanse of Greenland. Under the command of Edward Iceberg Smith, they established bases and conducted neutrality patrols. This was hemispheric defense in its purest form, foreshadowing the immense logistics and rescue operations that were to come. Domestically, the service expanded at a dizzying pace. The need to free up every available man for combat saw the establishment of the Women's Reserve, the SPARS, in November 1942. Initially, they took on clerical roles, but within months, these women were operating as radio technicians, aviation machinists' mates, and radar operators. Their adaptability proved essential to the war machine. On the shores, the Volunteer Port Security Force and the Beach Patrol Program were implemented. They guarded the U.S. coast utilizing 2,000 men, 200 dogs, and 500 horses. This massive response was validated by the landing of German saboteurs on Long Island and Florida. But the most immediate and terrifying threat to American security was the one launched by Admiral Karl Donitz. On Christmas Day 1941, Donitz initiated Operation Paukenschlag, known in English as Drumbeat. 6 German U-boats, sleek hunters built for long-range warfare, headed west. Their mission was to target the rich, soft shipping lanes from the Gulf of St. Joe, Lawrence down to Cape Hatteras. For the U-boat commanders, the American coast was a happy hunting ground. The U.S. Navy was unprepared and prioritizing the Pacific Theater, delaying the implementation of any convoy system. Merchant ships, unarmed, unescorted, and brightly lit against the dark coastline, sailed in easy visibility. On the night of January 14, 1942, The tanker Nornus became the first victim of drumbeat. The torpedo hit with a deafening, tearing sound, instantly sinking the ship off Long Island. The sinking was initially, ludicrously, reported as having struck a mine, but the truth quickly became undeniable. The war had arrived on the doorstep of the American mainland. In just 2 weeks, 20 merchant vessels, 150,000 tons of vital cargo and fuel were dragged to the bottom. By February, nearly 70 ships were gone. The Coast Guard, with its small fleet of Secretary-class cutters and Vogt OS-2U Kingfisher scout planes, was flung into the bloody vortex. The 327-foot cutters, designed for peacetime patrol, were now the primary defense against the silent, submerged killers. These were the vessels that had to hunt, rescue, and fight along the exposed, vulnerable coast. They were desperately trying to close the gap between the U-boat threat and the lagging American response. The conflict was no longer distant. The oil-slicked, freezing bodies washing ashore confirmed that the Battle of the Atlantic had begun, violent and merciless, just yards from American beaches. The implementation of the first partial convoy system along the vulnerable American coast in April 1942 provided a measure of relief, but it only shifted the core of the conflict to the vast, unforgiving expanses of the North Atlantic. The Coast Guard cutters, now serving as vital components of the ocean escort groups, were immediately thrust into the merciless struggle. Their mission was to keep the lifeline to Britain and North Africa open. Secretary-class cutters, like the Campbell, the Spencer, the Bibb, the Duane, and the Inham, became the steel backbone of this defense. They often took the western legs of the perilous convoy routes. Their baptism by fire was immediate and severe. The cutter, Alexander Hamilton, was torpedoed and lost in January 1942, a stark demonstration that the U-boat war respected no service insignia. The true test, however, arrived with the onset of the bloody winter of 1942 and 1943. This period was not merely difficult, it was a sustained physical assault delivered by nature and by man. The convoys entered the dreaded air gap south of Greenland. This battleground was known to the Allies as Torpedo Junction and to the Germans as Devil's Gorge. Aboard the CGC Ingham, the deck watch was a study in prolonged grinding misery, heavy seas, described by veterans as the worst North Atlantic storms in over 50 years, rendered both radar and sonar intermittently useless. The spray froze instantly, sheathing the cutter in crystalline armor. The constant rolling and pitching of the small warship made simple movement a struggle against gravity. Crews braced themselves against the cutter's violent roll, their exhaustion mounting daily. They were forced to remain alert in the icy darkness. The biting cold was a physical enemy that penetrated wool and canvas. It was a constant, brutal reminder that if the ship went down, the lethally cold water would claim them in minutes. In the early hours of December 17, 1942, the Ingham located a contact. The U-boat, designated U-626, was attempting to shadow the convoy. Commander Edward V. Ward immediately ordered the attack. The cutter shuddered as the depth charges rolled off the stern racks and launched from the K-guns. Time dilated in the icy air. Seconds stretched into eternity before the muffled, heavy percussion reached the surface. Then came the second, terrifying wave of explosions. The force was so immense that the Ingham's own deck plates rattled violently from the hammer effect of the charges detonating deep beneath the waves. Vast fountains of black seawater and spray shot skyward, momentarily dwarfing the small cutter. They had struck home. The Ingham circled the area, confirming the death of the submarine U-626. It was a victory measured only in the oil slick and debris that bubbled to the surface. But this success offered only a temporary reprieve. In 1443, over 100 U-boats were already operating in that same unforgiving air gap. Adding to the physical hardship was a strategic catastrophe of the mind. In March 1943, the German Kriegsmarine abruptly shifted its radio cipher. The priceless ultra-intelligence derived from breaking the German codes suddenly vanished. Allied commanders were now fighting blind. In just 3 weeks, the Allies lost 97 ships. Their escorts were overwhelmed, operating without the crucial foreknowledge of where the U-boat packs were gathering. The struggle became desperate, a contest of raw courage against superior numbers. Escort Group A3, flying the flag of Captain Heinemann, was locked in the vicious battle for convoy SC-121. The weather was brutal, and the U-boats were relentless, worn down but determined to make submerged attacks. During this battle, on the night of February 20th, 1943, Commander James Hirshfield aboard the CGC Campbell noted overwhelming HFDF contacts. The high-frequency direction finder, a technology the Coast Guard had perfected chasing rum runners, was now proving indispensable. The signals flooded the bridge. Hirshfield famously remarked to his bridge crew that they were in for a big party. In the ensuing chaos, the Campbell located U-606, commanded by Alt Hans Dohler. The U-boat was already disabled and had been forced to surface. Hirshfield, driven by the urgency of protecting his convoy and the primal instinct of a hunter who has cornered his prey, made a decision that defied naval protocol for a cutter. He ordered the ramming. The Campbell accelerated. The engine vibrated through the hull as the cutter bore down on the exposed metallic shell of the submarine. The impact was cataclysmic. A tremendous screeching sound echoed as the cutter's bow sliced into the pressure hull of the U-boat, lifting the submarine partially out of the water. Steel shrieked against steel. Hirshfield, standing on the bridge, was thrown by the impact and struck by shell fragments, wounded in the violent collision. U-606 was mortally wounded, its hull ripped open.
But the Campbell was also critically damaged.
Her own bow was stove in, leaving the cutter dead in the water in the midst of the Atlantic. Despite the staggering blow, the crew immediately turned to damage control. They secured their own vessel while capturing the surviving U-boat crew. It was a testament to the dual nature of their service. Destroy the enemy, then save the life. The breaking of the new German naval cipher in late March 1943, combined with the sheer aggression demonstrated by escort groups like A3, fundamentally shifted the balance. The priceless intelligence advantage was restored. The technological edge provided by HFDF and radar, utilized by these hardened Coast Guard crews, began to take its heavy toll. Crucially, the deployment of long-range B-24 Liberator bombers finally began to close the vital air gap. May 1943 became the clear, bloody tipping point, reaching an unsustainable level for the Kriegsmarine. Admiral Karl Donitz, recognizing the definitive failure of his campaign to sever the Atlantic lifeline, ordered the withdrawal of his forces from the main northern convoy routes. The merciless struggle had been won. The Coast Guard's cutters and their crews had endured the worst the Atlantic could offer, proving their worth not merely as escorts, but as formidable, aggressive anti-submarine warriors. They ensured that the vital supplies necessary for the liberation of Europe reached their destination. The Battle of the Atlantic may have crested in the spring of 1943, but the sea war was far from over. In the spring of 1944, the Mediterranean remained a deadly, active theatre. It proved that the German U-boat and air forces still possessed a lethal sting. In April, off the coast of Algeria, a large Africa-bound convoy was stalked by both submerged and aerial threats. The attack was swift and catastrophic. At least 20 German torpedo bombers screamed in low over the water. Their engines produced a deafening drone that quickly merged with the anti-aircraft fire. The freighter Paul Hamilton, a critical supply ship laden with tons of ammunition, took a direct hit. It was obliterated in a single, blinding flash of white light and thunder. The resulting explosion vaporized the vessel and sent shrapnel and debris raining down across the convoy. Amidst the chaos, the Coast Guard manned destroyer escort USS Menzies, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Frank M. McCabe, immediately engaged the attackers. The DE's guns spat fire, tracking the low-flying planes. Moments later, one bomber spiraled downward, trailing black smoke before hitting the water. McCabe's crew then performed the service's most ancient duty, rescue. They maneuvered the Menzies through the slick, debris-choked water. They pulled 137 survivors from the torpedoed USS Lansdale, and even 2 captured German airmen from the frigid sea. But the danger was not past. As the Menzies closed on the position of the U-371, which had surfaced behind the convoy, the submarine retaliated with cold, calculated precision. An acoustic torpedo, a weapon designed to home in on the sound of the ship's screws, slammed into the stern of the Menzies. The force of the detonation was sickening. It was a bone-jarring impact that tore the entire stern section from the ship, instantly claiming 31 lives. The destroyer escort was left dead in the water, her back broken. Yet she did not sink. The Coast Guardsmen, operating on instinct and training, refused to abandon the ship. They fought fire, contained flooding, and held the line, embodying the old Coast Guard expression, "You have to go out, but you don't have to come back." While the wounded Menges stabilized, the USS Pride located and crippled the U-371, forcing its crew to scuttle the vessel and surrender. The Menges, a testament to her crew's resolve, was later towed, repaired with a new stern, and returned to service.
She was a metal scar of the war she had survived.
The European theatre was not the only front demanding the Coast Guard's unique resilience. Thousands of miles away, in the harsh, fog-shrouded and unforgiving climate of the Aleutian Islands, the service maintained a lonely vigil. Following the Japanese attacks on Dutch Harbour in 1942, the cutter Onondaga's anti-aircraft gunners had fired nearly 2,000 rounds. But the true, grinding work was less glamorous. It involved establishing and maintaining the crucial, complex infrastructure of war. Coast Guardsmen built and manned ANRAC stations and, most critically, LORN stations. This long-range navigation system made fleet movement possible in those perpetually obscured waters. The campaign to reclaim the islands culminated in the invasion of Kiska. The sodden, desolate terrain was a constant, miserable challenge. Deck watches in the North Pacific required the heaviest winter clothing, yet every man knew that if he went overboard, the frigid water would claim him before any rescue could arrive. When Allied forces finally assaulted Kiska, after months of preparation and heavy losses on nearby Attu, they found a surreal, chilling emptiness. The Japanese garrison had been meticulously evacuated. The only enemy remaining were the booby traps left behind, which still managed to claim upwards of 20 Allied lives as the island was secured. The Coast Guard's role here was one of enduring, unacknowledged logistical support. This was the necessary, thankless work that underpinned major operations. That logistical expertise, combined with their renowned small boat handling skills, was about to be leveraged on the largest scale in history. By June 1944, all focus had shifted to the English Channel. Operation Neptune, the naval component of the D-Day landings, was an undertaking of unimaginable scale. The Coast Guard stood at its very heart. Their officers commanded assault groups, including Flotilla 10, a battle-tested unit. This flotilla was comprised of 36 landing craft, infantry, large, 24 of which were Coast Guard manned veterans of Sicily and Salerno. These shallow draft LCIs were deemed the heart of the Coast Guard's contribution. They were designed, crucially, to glide directly onto the sand. Before dawn on June 6, the air vibrated with the continuous roar of naval bombardment. Aboard the Coast Guard manned attack transport USS Bayfield, serving as the nerve center for the Utah Beach landings, Captain Lyndon Spencer oversaw the immense coordination effort. As the sun rose, the Coast Guard LCIs drove forward, their flat bottoms scraping against the seabed. They hit the designated beaches. Some, by navigational error, landed in a slightly better spot. The bow gangways slammed down. Full rifle companies, weighted down by gear and soaked by the cold, choppy English Channel water, poured out under intense German fire. The beaches instantly became a maelstrom of confusion and violence. Mortar fire rained down, churning the black sand and quickly turning the shoreline into a clogged and littered graveyard of disabled and stranded craft. The crucial task of clearing the shore was delayed. But even as the invasion raged, the Coast Guard performed its definitive humanitarian role. Following a suggestion from President Roosevelt himself, 60 small, wooden, 83-foot patrol boats had been deployed. This was the Matchbox Fleet, commanded by Commander Alexander Stewart. With their gasoline engines and thin wooden construction, they seemed laughably vulnerable against the might of the German defences. Yet their agility and shallow draft made them perfect for navigating the immediate chaos of the beachhead. They became the angels of the Channel. Throughout the long, bloody day, these matchbox-sized boats darted between the hulking LSTs and the burning wreckage, ignoring the incoming shells. Their crews pulled men from the cold water soldiers, whose landing craft had been broached by the surf or sunk by enemy fire. On D-Day alone, the Matchbox Fleet was credited with saving over 400 men. This was a fraction of the 1,438 total they rescued before being decommissioned. While the Army assault troops endured the crucible of combat on the bluffs, the Coast Guardsmen operating the small boats navigated a different kind of hell. It was a continuous life-and-death triage in the freezing water. This underscored that even in the largest military invasion ever mounted, the service's core mission of saving lives remained paramount. And Ireland, they were the armed service that delivered the troops, and the rescue service that ensured the wounded and the broken were not left to the tide. The ultimate goal of the European war, the liberation of the continent, was now underway, but the war machine demanded an ever-increasing pace of offensive action. The bulk of the US Navy's strength was already committed to the other side of the globe. The Pacific, a theater of vast distances and innumerable islands, required a constant grinding series of assaults. It was here, in the Solomons, the Marshalls, and the Marianas, that the Coast Guard's specialized skill set would prove indispensable. This was the mastery of small craft honed over a century of coastal rescue. The counter-offensive began on August 7, 1942, with the landing on Guadalcanal. This was the first major American amphibious assault of the war. The Coast Guard was immediately involved, its personnel operating the Higgins boats, LCVPs, and the crucial LVTs, or Amtraks. These vehicles were required to cross the reefs that guarded the Japanese-held shores. The strategic objective was clear: use the island-hopping tactic to bypass heavily fortified positions like Kolombangara. The goal was to secure less defended, but equally vital, spots like Vella La Vella, progressively pushing the enemy back toward their home islands. The lessons learned in the Solomons were paid for in blood. The high cost of contested landings reached a horrifying peak in November 1943 at Tarawa. The massive assault on Tarawa and Makin atolls involved nearly 200 vessels and over 35,000 troops. At Tarawa, the 2nd Marine Division was forced to virtually annihilate the Japanese garrison. The failure to accurately predict the tide and the depth of the surrounding reefs left many landing craft stranded hundreds of yards offshore. Marines waded through chest-high water under concentrated machine gun and mortar fire. The lagoon instantly turned into a slaughterhouse. The scene at Tarawa was a searing indictment of the initial tactics, but it drove immediate change. The rapid, successful capture of Majuro in January 1944 and Kwajalein in February 1944 proved the new accelerated timeline was possible. The Marshall Islands campaign involved nearly 300 vessels. The central goal was to establish forward bases for the fleet. That mission led to the colossal undertaking of Operation Forager, the invasion of the Marianas. The Mariana Saipan, Guam, and Tinian were crucial staging areas. They placed American B-29 bombers within striking distance of Japan itself. The invasion in June 1944 involved 535 ships and over 127,000 troops. Coast Guardsmen were everywhere, manning transports and, most critically, operating the small craft. These small craft were the only link between the massive fleet and the beachheads. The landing on Saipan was a savage, unrelenting trial. The transports anchored offshore, and the landing craft began their run-in. Aboard one LCVPs, the noise was deafening. There was the rhythmic, heavy thunder of the naval bombardment overhead, the constant high-pitched whine of shells passing, and the spray of near misses from Japanese mortars. The air was thick with the smell of burning oil and pulverized coral dust. The assault waves hit the beaches, and the chaos began instantly. The Japanese defenders, hidden in interlocking positions, waited for the landing craft to slow, then unleashed a torrent of fire. Signalman First Class Douglas A. Munro, already a veteran of the Solomons, was tasked with landing and supporting the Marines at Point Cruz on Guadalcanal months earlier. His experience, though geographically removed from the Marianas, defined the Coast Guard's sacrificial commitment to the infantry. On September 27, 1942, Munro's job was simple: ferry the troops in and wait for the signal to extract them. But the Marines ran into a heavy Japanese counterattack. The order came to pull them out immediately. Munro, only 22 years old, understood the geometry of the situation before him. The Marines were pinned down, facing certain annihilation. He swiftly organized the 10 landing craft under his command, establishing a protective line of boats near the shore. Then, with a devastating commitment, he personally piloted his own boat, a Higgins boat, slow and vulnerable, directly into the line of enemy fire. He used the vessel as a shield, drawing the attention of the Japanese machine gunners away from the exposed Marines scrambling onto the other boats. The air around Munro's boat shredded with incoming rounds. He could hear the distinct wet thud of bullets hitting the wooden hull, and the heavier whang of rounds striking the small metal engine casing that held the boat steady, a human decoy, until the last of the Marines were safely aboard the other craft and pulling away. As Munro finally began to pull his own boat out of the kill zone, a final burst of fire tore into him. He collapsed, mortally wounded, slumped over the controls. His last words, whispered to his shipmate, were not of fear, but of duty. Did they get off? Munro died 7 weeks after the initial Guadalcanal landings. He was the only Coast Guardsman in World War II to be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His action was the ultimate expression of the service's core identity, the saving of lives, even at the expense of one's own, carried out in the most extreme combat conditions, and the legacy of that dedication was evident months later in the Marianas. On Saipan, the Marines clung desperately to their beachhead, with limited ammunition, medical supplies, and support. The Coast Guard landing craft crew, navigating the treacherous lagoon, discovered a critical 4-foot-deep channel through the coral reef. This narrow, vital passage allowed the larger supply craft to finally reach the shore, preventing the beachhead from collapsing entirely. The push continued relentlessly. The invasion of Leyte in October 1944 marked the beginning of the liberation of the Philippines. General MacArthur's promised return. Operation King II was gargantuan, 738 vessels carrying over 193,000 troops. As the invasion flotilla approached the archipelago, a new, terrifying threat emerged: the kamikazes. These terrifying pilots were trading their lives for the destruction of the fleet, slamming into transports and destroyers. The Coast Guardsmen, who were often the first boots on the ground, had to survive this aerial onslaught just to get to the beach. The Coast Guard, manned LSTs, drove ashore, unloading supplies that would quickly accumulate to an incredible 7 tons of equipment and supplies for every man landed on Luzon. The campaign raged on, moving from the chaotic jungle mountains to the fierce, prolonged street fighting. Through it all, the Coast Guard crews kept the logistical pipeline flowing, bringing the men and materiel needed to break the Japanese resistance, one desperate island at a time. The service, once the quiet regulator of domestic waters, was now the vital delivery mechanism for the largest, most violent amphibious campaign in human history. The liberation of the Philippines was an ongoing, grinding campaign, but the ultimate prize lay closer to the Japanese home islands. The war machine demanded ever-increasing pressure, culminating in the final, bloodiest amphibious assaults of the Pacific. As the focus shifted, the Coast Guard, its officers and crews hardened by years in the Atlantic and across the equatorial Pacific, was positioned at the tip of the spear. Every year, as the jungle fighting continued in Manila, the 327-foot cutter CGC Ingham, a veteran of the brutal North Atlantic convoys, steamed into the harbor of Manila Bay. On February 16, 1945, the Ingham served as the flagship for the Corregidor landings. She maneuvered to within 3,500 yards of San Jose Beach, a final, significant symbol of the service's dual theater commitment. It was a rapid, symbolic victory that cleared the way for the inevitable, terrifying next step: the invasion of Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima, a volcanic island less than 4 miles long, was not just heavily fortified, it was a fortress carved into the earth, honeycombed with concealed Japanese positions. On February 19, 1945, after a relentless pre-dawn naval bombardment, the assault began. The Coast Guard, manned LSTs and smaller assault craft, including the submarine chaser PC-469, drove toward the southeast shoreline. The conditions were immediately, violently hostile. The surf, instead of breaking gently, slammed directly onto the beaches, a physical force that broached the smaller craft, turning them sideways and carrying them uncontrollably up the shore. The sand was not white coral, but black volcanic grit, heavy and unstable, sucking at the treads of vehicles. As the first waves hit, the Japanese mortars, which had been silent during the bombardment, erupted. The air filled with the high, tearing shriek of incoming rounds. The beaches instantly became a killing zone, and the crucial task of clearing the shoreline was delayed by the sheer intensity of the fire. Within hours, the 7 landing beaches, stretching 3,500 yards, were clogged and littered with stranded craft. A visual testament to the struggle, damage control men and boat crews worked furiously, scrambling under fire to free the broached vessels. They knew that every minute the beach remained choked, The Marines inland went without critical supplies. If Iwo Jima was a battle of relentless attrition, Okinawa was a campaign of overwhelming scale and terror. On Easter morning, April 1st, 1945, the invasion commenced. The task force was immense. Over 1,400 vessels carrying more than 548,000 personnel. 53 Coast Guard ships participated, alongside 6 others manned by partial crews. The logistical needs were insatiable, but the geography itself conspired against the invaders. Coral formations offshore limited unloading operations for LCVPs and LCMs to only 6 hours of high tide. This forced the larger transports to anchor for dangerously long periods of time. It was during these vulnerable waiting periods that the Japanese unleashed their most devastating weapon. The sky above Okinawa became a continuous gauntlet of kamikaze attacks. Day after day, the suicide planes descended, trading the lives of their pilots for the destruction of the fleet. The air was a constant, shrieking alarm, punctuated by the heavy, shuddering impact of planes hitting steel. The Coast Guard bore the brunt of this aerial terror. The LST 8884, a crucial landing ship, became a victim of a suicide plane attack. The kamikaze pilot slammed into the vessel, transforming the deck into an inferno. The crew fought the raging fires, but the damage was terminal, forcing the LST's abandonment. 24 lives were lost in the explosion and subsequent sinking, a grim statistic contributing to the staggering combined Navy and Coast Guard casualties of the 82-day campaign. 4,974 were wounded. The sheer volume of incoming attacks left 36 vessels sunk and 368 ships damaged, 120 of them amphibious craft. The fight for Okinawa was not just a battle for land, it was a merciless struggle to keep the floating logistical base alive. Yet, amidst the violence of the Pacific and Atlantic, the Coast Guard's operational reach extended into territories few knew about. In the covert world of the OSS Maritime Unit, over half of the 226 men serving in August 1944 were drawn from the Coast Guard. They used their boat-handling expertise for infiltration, espionage, and sabotage operations. Even in the China-Burma-India theater, 3 officers and 21 enlisted guardsmen trained over 500 Chinese personnel in the use of dogs and horses for crucial patrol duties. It was a throwback to the domestic beach patrols, now exported to the far side of the globe. By the war's end, the Coast Guard commanded an operational fleet of over 1,400 ships. This included 802 of its own cutters and hundreds of specialized naval vessels. 77 LSTs, 75 frigates, and 21 attack cargo ships were all under their flag. Their damage controlmen possessed the knowledge and skills of numerous civilian professional trades. It was this expertise that kept countless battered ships afloat under impossible conditions. They sank 11 enemy submarines. They rescued more than 4,000 lives during active operations. Their personnel earned nearly 2,000 decorations, including the Medal of Honor awarded to Douglas Munro. The service proved, definitively, that it was not merely a peacetime agency or a support auxiliary, it was a formidable four-armed service. They were capable of executing the Navy's most complex combat missions. They embodied their motto, Semper Paratus, always ready, that up. This immense expansion and the decentralized nature of their wartime service created a complex legacy. The temporary reservists who had patrolled the beaches and harbors were eventually awarded the Victory Medal in 1946. But what of the thousands of dedicated Coast Guard auxiliarists? These were the men and women who had volunteered their time and their own boats to protect the home front. They received little public recognition or veterans' benefits after the war concluded. Vice Admiral Weish offered his deep thanks, stating their service was indispensable in freeing up thousands of guardsmen for overseas duty. Bemen made the sacrifices made by the group known as the Hooligan Navy remained an overlooked chapter in the history books. It was a stark contrast between their vital contributions and the quiet obscurity of their return to civilian life after the guns finally fell silent in 1945. The Coast Guard officially returned to the Treasury Department on January 1, 1946. Their wartime mission was complete. Their identity, forged in the heat of global combat, was forever redefined by the enormous canvas of World War II operations. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories, and please Share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.